against major buildings in the United States on the eastern seaboard. The horrific sequence began just before 9 o'clock in the morning, local time. Two planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, in the south of Manhattan, causing both buildings to collapse. It's not yet known how many people were killed, but at least 50,000 people work in those two towers alone. A third plane then crashed into the Pentagon Defense Headquarters in Washington. This is the scene in Washington at the Pentagon shortly after the incident. At least one of the planes was hijacked before being used in the attack. This is the scene at the World Trade Center, the two towers at this point intact. This was shortly after one of them had literally been scythed in two by one hijacked aircraft, believed to be a hijacked plane which had been taken just after it took off from Boston. Shortly after this, the first tower collapsed, and then the second tower collapsed. There were third and fourth incidents. The third incident at the Pentagon, and a fourth plane then crashed in southern Pennsylvania. Here in New York City, the mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, has ordered the evacuation of lower Manhattan. In Washington, D.C., government buildings, including the White House, have also been evacuated. All civilian aircraft were grounded by the Federal Aviation Administrations. Customs officials have also announced the Mexican and Canadian borders are closing. Let's get this update on these horrific events from Mike Wooldridge.
This was the second of the explosions. A plane comes in from the right of the picture and appears to be about to pass behind the South Tower. Next comes a huge explosion with debris showering out from the tower and down towards the streets below as the upper floors are immediately obscured by the billowing smoke. By now, the other tower, the North Tower, was already ablaze at the top as well after being struck by another plane. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 bombing of this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world, but this was to be infinitely more audacious. Some of those trapped inside went to desperate lengths in the hope of rescue. The same desperation led others to jump to an inevitable death. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center. With good reason, as it turned out, for within the hour, one of the huge 110-story towers collapsed, and the surrounding area resembled a war zone.
The first one we didn't see, but my co-worker saw the plane hit number 2 World Trade, and we just saw people just falling, jumping out the window. So that's about it.
We were looking at the fire from a distance, and then we saw a few bodies, people just flying out the window. I saw at least four bodies coming through the window. It was a sad day.
But it seemed that with every passing minute there was news that heralded terrorist action on an even bigger scale. The reports of aircraft being hijacked, and then this, a plane crashing onto a helicopter landing pad close to the Pentagon in Washington, the heart of the US defense establishment. This was the scene afterwards. The White House and other federal buildings were evacuated, and all planes across the country were grounded. But New York had not seen the last of the apocalyptic events there. The second of the World Trade Center towers collapsed, burying yet more of the city's financial district under rubble. It's still impossible to calculate the number of victims of these unbelievable, virtually simultaneous attacks. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
Well, reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon has come from leaders around the world. Here's my colleague Geeta Gurumurthy.
Soon after the first explosions in New York, President Bush spoke of his shock and horror at the unfolding tragedy.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Worldwide, there was a sense of growing disbelief as thoughts turned to who was to blame. A Palestinian group, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, denied initial reports that it was responsible.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
But some in the Middle East were celebrating in the streets, here at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, expressed his sympathies.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
The spiritual leader of Hamas said they didn't support the attacks, but they were the effects of America's policies of oppression.
America is reaping what it sows in oppression and implanting vengeance in the hearts of those who have been wronged by the oppression and corruption. However, in principle, we do not support attacks against civilians or innocents.
But across Europe, leaders like the British Prime Minister sent this warning to those responsible.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Across the globe, governments are now tightening their security, fearful in the wake of such terror and carnage. Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Well, let's now pick up with information coming from Washington and New York City. First of all, from Washington, where the Pentagon was hit by what an Associated Press correspondent described as an airliner, which ploughed into the side of the building. He described seeing the tail fin of the aircraft, of what he called a large airliner. Quote, it ploughed right into the Pentagon. That apparently is on the opposite side to the office of Donald Rumsfeld, who's the defense secretary. But a Pentagon spokesman quoted by the Associated Press out of Washington said there have been, quote, extensive casualties inside this building, the Pentagon, and an unknown number of fatalities. We do not know the extent of the injuries. But he went on to say the leadership of the Defense Department is okay. Secretary Rumsfeld is also okay. He told reporters this a short time ago. Now, Israel has announced that it's cancelling all flights. Let's go to New York City, where both towers of the World Trade Center are now demolished. They crumbled following the extraordinary and horrific scenes when two aircraft flew into the side of the building shortly before 9 o'clock during the rush to work, the commute in New York City. And Mayor Giuliani has now declared southern Manhattan a zone of evacuation because under all that dust and debris and horrendous weight of whatever was falling out of those twin towers were, of course, a large number of people either marooned in their offices or jumping out or on the ground with emergency officials, emergency crews on the ground.
Yeah.
Here is President Bush. Now, we were talking about New York City and the horrendous scenes there around the World Trade Center. That was going to be remarks from President Bush, who's been in Florida. It was a tape replay. We thought it was going to be taken live. But George Bush has been in Sarasota in Florida. He stopped off in Louisiana. Here's George W. Bush, the president, again.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
George W. Bush at an Air Force base in Louisiana. He'd been in Sarasota in Florida earlier when the news had come through. We're not sure if he is returning to Washington. That remains uncertain. Let's now go live to Washington to our correspondent, one of our many correspondents, Rob Watson. Rob, we can see smoke rising over your left shoulder of the Pentagon. What's the scene in Washington, D.C. at this time?
Well, you're absolutely right. That is smoke coming from the Pentagon, where an aircraft hit either the building or just very near it. There has been extensive damage at the Pentagon, if we stay with that for the time being. Apparently there are extensive casualties and fatalities. Part of the building has collapsed. Now, the broader picture is that if these attackers wanted to bring the United States and its capital to a halt, they have certainly succeeded, because I've been walking the streets of Washington. That the government, the city, is at a standstill. All government buildings have been evacuated, including the White House, and the streets are filled with thousands of people turned out of their offices. And because the planes, trains have all been stopped, there is complete chaos, a complete gridlock.
Rob, is it literally a state of complete shock? People unable to know what's happened?
You'll have to repeat that. I temporarily lost you.
Rob, is it literally a state of shock where people simply cannot comprehend what has happened in Washington and the United States?
I think that's exactly right. I would say that the United States has been stunned by this attack and its people, because I was just outside as the attack on the Pentagon happened. Shortly afterwards, you could hear explosions. There was smoke coming from the Pentagon. Immediately, people were evacuated from federal buildings, and I can tell you they were shocked, they were stunned. Most had no idea what was happening. Some were very frightened. One woman told me she would certainly be too scared to go back inside. I think that the United States at this point and its people are digesting this. They're talking about it on the streets, because you have to understand that the streets are crammed with people who cannot get back into their buildings, and because of the traffic jams everywhere, are stuck where they are. This is all they're talking about. At this stage, it's a sense of disbelief, but I think that's going to quickly turn to anger.
Now, Rob, just before we move on to other issues, the Pentagon itself, from what you have seen and what you can piece together, what happened to this aircraft? We've seen the most extraordinary video of what happened to the World Trade Center, but an AP correspondent was describing how all that he could see left was the tail fin of an aircraft.
I haven't been able to get that close to the Pentagon. The first I saw of the attack was the smoke rising. It's not entirely clear whether there was a direct hit on the Pentagon or very nearby, but what you can say is that it's obvious that the damage is extensive. Someone said that there were a number of the parts of the structure had completely collapsed and that there are extensive casualties and certainly fatalities too. And the fire has been going now, by my reckoning, for about three or four hours. It's obviously a big explosion.
Now, what about what's happened to the organs of state and government, large agencies in buildings all around where you are at the moment, not just US government, World Bank and all those other big institutions? What is this going to mean for the running of the democracy of America?
Well, I can tell you that it has all come to a standstill, and that certainly all the buildings around me, and you can imagine the United States is a very large government. Every building has been evacuated with all of their staff standing either outside the buildings or trying to figure out how to get home. But the government, the day-to-day government as such, appears to have come to a complete halt. Now, I understand that the measures are being taken to keep things going. Apparently there are efforts underway to make sure that the Treasury, for example, keeps printing dollar bills. But I don't think there's any doubt that at this point the United States government is in some kind of disarray.
Now, should we be asking about the bipartisan political response to this? What have both parties been saying, or are politicians up on the Hill, which of course is evacuated as well, are politicians literally too stunned to even begin to comprehend it?
I think they are too stunned, and you're absolutely right. They have been evacuated. I was watching the evacuation. I was just standing nearby Capitol Hill when it happened, and I think congressmen have been taken apparently to a secure place. But I don't think there's any doubt that this will bring, there will be no partisanship about this. This will bring Democrats and Republicans together. Interestingly, it's already been summed up as another Pearl Harbor by one Republican senator. But I think you're going to see the Congress coming together and the US government. But for now, at least, they don't seem to have any idea what's hit them or who hit them.
Rob Watson, thanks for joining us live from the center of Washington, D.C., with a picture there of the Pentagon, the smoke coming from the Pentagon behind him. Well, let me turn to Stephen Simon, who until 1999 was President Clinton's responsible official for counterterrorism. Let me quote now the words of President George W. Bush. We saw him there in Louisiana. "Freedom has been attacked by faceless cowards. There will be the full resources of the federal government, but make no mistake, the US will hunt down and punish those responsible." Doesn't that carry an enormous price as well as responsibility, given the price that appears to have been paid for bringing those responsible for the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam bombs to justice in New York?
Well, I think this attack would have taken place even if those responsible for the Nairobi and Dar attacks had never been apprehended or had never even been pursued. There are enemies of the United States who are very strongly motivated, who see themselves in a very long-run battle. They don't see this as a series of one-offs or tit-for-tats. They see it as a serious, protracted war. And their actions aren't governed by what the United States happens to do in response to one or another attack. So no, I don't think that the United States somehow brought this attack upon itself by having pursued the East Africa bombers.
Because those who were apprehended and finally tried were actually tried in a courtroom somewhere under that massive smoke in the south of Manhattan at the courthouse there. Would you say that there will be absolutely no second thoughts about taking retaliation if there is some kind of electronic or paper trail or intelligence trail which leads to a group of people?
It's difficult to see no retaliatory action being taken if there's a clear trail of responsibility. But retaliation depends not just on there being a clear paper trail or electronic trail to follow. It depends also on having a target that can actually be struck. And that's not a foregone conclusion in this case.
What about your concern about other possible attacks? Do you believe that this is it? Or do you believe or fear that this is the start of something which will go on for an indeterminate period?
Well, I think this is something that is one in a train that has already begun with the World Trade Center bombing. It happens to be a particularly horrific and successful attack. It certainly isn't the last. The adversary, whoever it is that launched this assault.
And we must emphasize that no one has claimed responsibility.
No one has claimed responsibility.
We are not apportioning blame. We're merely talking about one incident where there's proven evidence.
We don't really know, but this attack suggests such enormous determination, initiative, drive, and hatred that it's difficult to see the attacker, especially since he was successful, not attempting to go another round at a time and a place of his choosing.
Now, as we look at the inevitable human horror and response to what has happened, just the very trauma of what's happened, can you imagine the difficulties now of some of your former colleagues, civil servants, government service employees, who now have to pick up the bits of this, both politically, diplomatically, security-wise, when they've actually probably suffered as well?
It's going to be very difficult. Having said that, the interagency organization that deals with exactly this sort of thing is very robust. It's very difficult to disrupt it. It's designed to withstand the attack, an attack of this kind, or the stress caused by an attack of this kind. So the investigative, the rescue work, the intelligence work, the diplomacy will go on, I would think, pretty much unhindered, actually.
Now, what kind of scene can we imagine in the Situation Room underneath the White House and the executive buildings there? You've been through this many times, but this is now a major catastrophe. It's not fighting in Kuwait or whatever. This is now something on the doorstep. Who will be around that table? Which agencies will be represented?
The Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Justice. I would guess Health and Human Services will be there too in some form, the Public Health Service, because there is an enormous public health problem now in Manhattan. The trauma alone and the need to flow assistance to local emergency response agencies is just enormous. So they'll be at the table. The FBI will, of course, be at the table, and the State Department. So, you know, you've got a pretty good crew.
And will it literally be the most senior people who are available in town at this particular point?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. The National Security Advisor will periodically convene the heads of all these agencies. But the heads of these agencies have a lot to do right now, and they won't want to be spending 24 hours a day in meetings talking to one another. They've got enormous operations to run. The meetings that will be taking place almost constantly will be of the specific counterterrorism-related officials within these agencies.
The issue is about getting hard, reliable information about which there's no doubts, whether it be on the humanitarian side or on the security intelligence side.
That's right. And with respect to security intelligence, not just who done it, but is there anything else going to happen?
Stephen Simon, thank you for the moment, for joining us. Stephen Simon, who until 2 years ago was responsible for counterterrorism within the National Security Council of President Clinton in the White House. Let's now go to Islamabad, to Pakistan, to Kate Clark, our Afghanistan correspondent. Kate, there have been words said about the incidents in New York and Washington, where you are.
Yes, absolutely. There was an emergency press conference called by the Taliban ambassador in Pakistan. He wanted an urgent message to be delivered to the American people. He said that Afghanistan felt their pain and hoped the terrorists would be caught and brought to justice and to trial. Now, this is urgent because 3 years ago, America bombed targets in Afghanistan following the attacks on 2 of their embassies in Africa, and the Taliban clearly want to try and forestall any American wrath that might be directed towards them or directed towards Osama bin Laden.
Now, we are not apportioning blame in any way, and no one's claimed responsibility, no one's pointed a finger. But was any question asked about Osama bin Laden, who, of course, is on sovereign Afghan territory?
Yes, the ambassador said that Osama bin Laden could not have been responsible. You can see him speaking now. He was very clear about this. He repeated the Taliban line that he has no communication equipment with the outside world. Now, this is something that the Americans and others have questioned very seriously. The other thing that the Taliban ambassador said was that he hoped that America would launch a full investigation and reveal its evidence to the world before it made any move.
Now, what's your feeling in Islamabad about how this is being viewed on whichever side of the political and religious spectrum people are sitting?
Well, I think people here are very nervous about another American attack on Afghanistan. Last time it was incredibly destabilizing to, for example, the humanitarian aid effort. Everyone, all the expatriates had to evacuate. And now, 3 years on, the crisis in Afghanistan is much more severe. There's huge humanitarian problems with the drought and the continuing civil war. I imagine a lot of the embassy staff, a lot of diplomats and aid workers will be worried, particularly those who've got personnel in Afghanistan, that if America does launch an attack, there will be repercussions.
I have to underline here, Kate, that we are only speculating. It's far too early to say who's responsible. No one has yet claimed that responsibility. Should I be asking at this point about Ahmed Shah Massoud, given that that happened yesterday? Could that in any way have been connected to this?
I don't think so. That was an internal Afghan affair. Although, of course, the opposition have blamed Osama bin Laden. They said that that was a technically sophisticated attack and had good logistical support. That's why they thought he was involved. If you remember the assassination attempt against Ahmed Shah Massoud, the main anti-Taliban Afghan leader, involved two men posing as journalists with explosives hidden inside a camera. There's still no word on Ahmed Shah Massoud, whether supporters are saying he's still alive. There have been reports that he's died, but we still don't know yet.
Kate Clark, thanks for joining us, our Afghanistan correspondent, speaking to me there from Islamabad. Well, let me just give you an update from the Middle East. The Israeli Air Force has been put on high alert following what has happened in New York City and Washington. And shortly after the attacks on the eastern seaboard of the United States, the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat said this.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Yasser Arafat. Well, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was in the studio with me shortly after the incidents in the United States, and he described to me what he called an attack on civilization.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. The same kind of struggle that our forefathers launched against the piracy on the high seas.
In your position as Prime Minister, Defense Minister, also formerly in the Army, were you ever aware of any incident planned like this?
Not in the dimensions, but different elements where there clearly there was an attempt on the Twin Towers. A few years ago, there was an attempt to explode the Holland Tunnel leading into Manhattan. But of this size and a simultaneous attack, I don't think that anyone had predicted it in advance.
Is it something that security services, intelligence services could ever have got wind of?
I'm not